15th of the COVID calls, a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Kim Fortune, standing in for COVID calls host Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a cultural anthropologist who studies disaster and environmental health vulnerability. My co-host is Mike Fortune, a historian and anthropologist of the life sciences. We're both calling in from the Department of Anthropology, University of California, Irvine, on the native lands of the Tongva and the Akjakamen. Today, we'll discuss a new research data resource, the Pandemic Vulnerability Index, built by researchers at the U.S. National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, North Carolina State University, and Texas A&M University. Just a few reminders before we begin. You can catch COVID calls live most weekdays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time on the COVID Calls YouTube channel. You can hear COVID Call podcasts from the full archive over almost every day for over a year on Spotify, iTunes, and Podbeam. And you can follow COVID Calls at Twitter at US of Disaster or COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for guests and future topics. As of today, July 28th, 2021, there are, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, a confirmed 4,182,405 deaths globally, over 600,000 in the US, and over 13,590 in North Carolina, where our guests call in from today. One goal of COVID calls is to give humanity to numbers like these, recollecting both the sufferings and harms, but the many creative ways the researchers and practitioners in many different situations have tried to respond. And this is what we'll hear about today, a really impressive effort to build our capacity to characterize and thus address the COVID-19 pandemic. Our guests today are Dr. Allison Motzinger-Reif and Dr. Reif, both environmental health scientists. Allison is chief and a principal investigator in the Biostatistics and Computational Biology branch at the U.S. National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Her research focuses on the development and application of modern statistical approaches for understanding the etiology of common complex diseases. David is a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at North Carolina State University, where his research focuses on complex interactions between human health and the environment using bioinformatics and statistical methods, visual analytics, experimental design, and software for the integrated analysis of high-dimensional, multi-scale data from diverse sources. And we'll hear about how their research background brought them into a position of leadership in the Pandemic Vulnerability Index that we'll talk about. But before we go there, I'd like to start by just asking Allison and David to tell us where you're calling in from and what the COVID-19 pandemic looks like there at this point.
Yeah, so we're calling in from Raleigh, North Carolina. We're at North Carolina State University's campus in David's office building here. And unfortunately, sort of numbers are rising here like they are everywhere else. We're not at sort of the most risk. Luckily, sort of case numbers seem to be rising, but hospitalization and deaths don't seem to be moving too too high, at least for our county.
Yeah, there's a lot of capacity, I think here.
Yeah. Allison, you're the chief of the Biostatistics and Computational Biology branch at NIEHS. Can you say a little about the mission and work of NIEHS and how it differs from some of the other federal science agencies that have been more visibly at the forefront of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so at least speak to sort of the subpart of the mission of NIEHS that I'm involved in. So National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences is one of the National Institutes of Health. And I actually sit in the Division of Intramural Research is where I am and where my branch is. And it really is the goal of intramural research to do high risk, high reward research. So in terms of sort of contributing to the COVID-19 efforts, that has been on sort of more of the discovery side, the active research side, that hopefully will translate to public policy. But we are different in our sort of pure research mission than somebody like the CDC that really is sort of taking action and sort of implementing public health decisions. We are hoping to contribute to the scientific knowledge in the space that then could help others.
I think this is an important part of the story that's not always understood, both in the US, but also thinking across national lines, revolving around the questions like, where is science done in a society? Is it done within government agencies, within academia, within the pharmaceutical industry, and what makes a difference and where it's done and the kind of science that gets done? And so one of the questions we'll have from you going forward is, why was it the role of NIHS to get involved in the vulnerability index? But laying the ground by reminding us that it's a basic research outfit that you're speaking from. And how, besides, before getting involved in building the pandemic, what was NIHS charged to do, or was it left to individual labs to figure out what they could contribute? How was the response to the pandemic organized?
Yeah, and I can't speak to all of sort of the organization, but certainly from the Division of Intramural Research, it's very PI driven. There certainly are strong collaborations and branches and laboratories that have themes, but it is a PI driven sort of
in your own
that I'm a part of.
Yeah, and in your own lab, did you pivot to any kind of COVID focus over the last year or so?
Also, certainly this collaboration and effort was sort of our pivot to COVID-19 with some of the modeling aspects.
And David, can you say a little about your institutional context? I think of North Carolina State as having strong partnerships with both EPA and NIHS in the research triangle, but share with our readers a little sense of like what ecology you are in.
So I'm in a Department of Biological Sciences, which brings together, I was in the Department of Genetics. They merged it with a bunch of other departments. And so Biological Sciences covers from your smallest, the animals that you learned about in high school biology, the very early, the lowest life forms on the taxonomy, all the way up. And then we have a vet school. So one of the things about our university is that we really go from like molecules up to, cows and horses and things like that. And that's an interesting place to be. But I sit in a bioinformatics center, which means that all around me are people from computer science, statistics, geneticists from my department and elsewhere. We have plant pathology. So I sit basically in a data science center. And so when this happened and the pandemic came up, there weren't hallway conversations anymore, which is weird because everyone was at home. But a lot of the conversation was about where are data? Are there things that we can use? What do we do? We're all sort of used to taking different bits of information and putting them together, but that conversation kind of happened again. It was just remote and difficult. And then, the PBI resulted from conversations across the country, really.
Yeah. We definitely want to hear more about that. But before we get into the PBI, can we ask you, David, because you have been for a long time developing what the kind of general tool that became ToxPi. And so can you just tell the listeners kind of what that is, where it came from, what it was purposed to do, and then the new kinds of purposes that it began to acquire?
Yeah.
And the difficulty here is that it's literally a visualization tool, and we're going to be in only audio form for perpetuity. So it's going to be a challenge to kind of describe what the tool is, but I'll trust you to do that.
Sure. Yeah. So I hope that, listeners can, click on some links that, are linked off the page to look at stuff. But if the origin of it, before I even describe what it looked like, is that I worked in what was a startup company within EPA. At the time, which was the National Center for Computational Toxicology, felt like a startup company. And what they were tasked with doing was is there some new high throughput way that we can test chemicals in the environment? Because there's very thorough, rigorous testing that goes into every safety regulation, but people have known for a long time, and the technology finally caught up to the idea that we'll never be able to test everything. So the center was charged with that. And effectively, we were left with reams and reams of data from these high throughput tests that were all diverse and coming from different systems. And so maybe you're testing chemical A in, in an assay about gene expression for a particular pathway that you think is important. And maybe you're also seeing whether it kills these certain cells. And so each assay is asking a different question of the data of the chemical. And so the idea of ToxBio was that when we would go up to the EPA folks who live in DC and talk to them about what we were doing, they spend their day thinking about different things than reams of data, right? Like they have different expertise. So I just drew a picture of it, right? And by I drew a picture, I mean, this whole team got together and did this. But what we came up with was that if you sum all the pieces of information that are about a particular slice of the story, right? Like everything that has to do with cardiovascular function, you could put that in a slice. Everything that has to do with endocrine function, you could put that in a slice. And so you get this circle that is called a radar chart. It was originally invented, the first publication I've seen of it is either 1870 by a guy named Georg Meyer or Florence Nightingale, these Nightingale plots, right? So this is a really old visualization. But essentially what you do is you look at, for each entity, you say, the more colored area you have in these slices of information, the more concern you have about it. So if you have a big slice for cardiovascular activity from all the information that went into that slice, you're concerned about cardiotoxicity for that particular chemical. And if you have a big slice for endocrine activity, you're very concerned about the endocrine potential of that compound. So originally we were using it to compare and rank thousands of compounds and say which compound is most concerned, which should we test first, which one is lowest concern. But then the slices give you some idea of, well, it's of concern because this is an endocrine disruptor or a cardiotoxic chemical or immunological or whatever else. So that's the origin of the tool, and it was really grew out of that that center that was, and on the original paper are actually like several of the people who stayed with us to go do the PVI. So it's been a long running effort for sure.
Can you say a little more about what generated the weighting, the kind of color scheme, and what kind of decision points there were in developing that capability?
Yeah, and so is this for the index itself? For the yeah. So for that one, if it's hard to put ourselves in a time machine back to March of 2020, a little bit because it was a weird time, right? But if you remember, there was, we were wiping down boxes when they showed up, and people were like, "Are my groceries safe?" All these things. We didn't know anything, right? So there was a ton of data, and just coming online data streams that we could use, and it was really hard to sort of sift through that and say which of these things are actually important. So what we did is we actually, part of the team, at particular Wei-Shui Chu and Yvonne Rusin at Texas A&M, think a lot about risk assessment and how to bring that kind of information together. And so we sifted through the data and said, here's what we can get that is open source, that is free and that we trust. And really importantly, is available across the country. And that at the beginning was also not true, because a rural county in Wyoming had a very different health department budget than suburban DC or, and that's still true. But the information we had to find information we could find everywhere, to be fair. And then things that we thought had something to do with the index. And a lot of them at the beginning, especially, were standing social vulnerabilities, right? So it was not necessarily case rates and infection, but do you have the infrastructure where you live to have enough healthcare capacity? Are people tending to live kind of on top of each other? Are they moving en masse in and out of a congested area every day? And those are those data weren't unique to COVID. Those are data that people had, but we thought were important for COVID. So as we apportion the data, that was the conversation we were having, is before having any history to know what was important, what do we think is important? And then it's now evolved to now we can retrospectively say on day 0, how well do we think it predicts the next caseload, cases and deaths, and retrospectively, does it perform well a month behind, 2 months behind, 3 months behind? Now we can have it be more data driven. But at the beginning, it was really I think an expert judgment, expert elicitation kind of a thing, where we had to think about what would make sense based on what we knew about a brand new problem.
Yeah. So you said that you. Go ahead.
Can I get in there for a second, Kim? So we want to certainly come back to these questions of the data sources and where they're from, and in more detail about the particular data sets. But again, just for listeners, when David was talking about slices, the best way to visualize it is literally as like a slice of pizza. And if you have an entire pizza and divide it into 12 slices, and each one of those represents a different form, a different data set and a different kind of risk, and they can be smaller or larger slices, and then shading. But I'll let David go back into that. But so to go back to March 2020, and I'm it's really interesting that it was so early on. But given that one of the tools most kind of pertinent capacities is to present a kind of systems level view to a diverse set of users and audiences. So, and maybe this is more of a question for Allison then, but maybe both of you. The question of who the initial sort of group of people who came together to start developing it, and the different kinds of communities and disciplines that they represented in, I would call a kind of transdisciplinary kind of community, and what it was like to pull that together, how it came together, and what were the kind of process along the way, the challenges, the pleasures, et cetera.
Yeah, I'll start, and then
Go for it.
So I was going to say the scientifically there are several nodes connecting all of the authors on previous things. So Allison had worked with Dr. Rusin and Dr. Wright on several projects independent of me. I had worked with Dr. Rusin and Dr. Wright and Dr. Chu. Allison and I have worked together on several projects. And so the nodality of the people was actually already there. We were kind of in conversation, and it just turned out that everybody had just the right set of skills. Like it was that, we were, the Skylar Marvel, who's the lead developer on the project, he's the wrote all the software, all the code for it. He and I were working on a project that was about GIS data, ToxPy overlaying GIS data. So how do you drop this onto a map? And we had published a version with Wei Shui and Yvonne at Texas A&M. And then as these data started coming online, it was almost hard to think about anything else back in, that time of like, well, what do we have? And so we actually started with a global version of it. So we're collecting data from every country. But then we quickly realized that the disparity between what different countries had was greater than the different counties in the US. And we didn't want to add noise to a loud conversation, right? So we thought, all right, let's focus on where we feel like the data are really good and quality is going to get better. So we focused on the US. And then Allison does machine learning all the time, and her group does. And so Matt Wheeler, who's one of the other co-authors, was working on ways to crunch enormous sets of data through sophisticated modeling pipelines. And we thought, yeah, we can actually do predictions. What if we predicted, not just said, here's what your status is today, but based on your status, we're worried that this is where your trajectory is going to go with deaths and cases. And then Fred Wright and Yue Zhou and Kunqing Song at NC State are my colleagues in the Bioinformatics Center, and they're epidemiologists who are experts at putting together data and trying to figure out which pieces of data are most important for the modeling. Right? We started doing that. And then John House at NIHS started doing that too, doing machine learning to say which variables are actually important. And then Skylar and I were, kind of at both ends trying to figure out, like, how do we code all this? How do we code everyone's wishes? And Yvonne and Weishui with their expert guidance on like what to include and sort of how to communicate it to people, right? So it would actually get beyond just the scientists. And then me on the other end of what, some oversight of what can we do and how we can actually make it sustainable, because I think it was, even back then, it was obvious to everybody back in March that it wasn't going to be a 1 month kind of problem. Like, so we wanted to build something that could actually be modular and grow with time. And I think that's where NIEHS was extremely important with all their web team, because there's an infrastructure that's stable, and it's hard to underestimate how important that is here. Or it's easy to underestimate how important that is, that if you're going to have something with dynamic data, it gets updated daily, right? So it's been updated daily with thousands of data points since last March, and it can't break, right? So like, that's really, really difficult to do, and a thing that I think maybe academic centers are less often equipped, to kind of handle.
Yeah.
Well, and it strikes me as somewhat different than the data sets that I would imagine you usually deal with, which would be pretty stable and not changing that rapidly.
Exactly. Yeah, the daily updates is a continual challenge, because all of the data sources change too. So if people want to really nerd out on data science, right, we have a there's a GitHub with all the data. You can go and model it yourself, but each source changes periodically, and so you're constantly trying to like fix these. I think of them as pipes. You're just connecting data pipes to a thing, and that is a constant gardener kind of a situation.
Explicate for us a little bit about the diversity of data sources. And you said at the outset that there was lots of data about what, and the social determinants data, was out there kind of ready to go. But what else did you add to the mix?
Yeah, I think we started with the ones that had to be included, which are the infection rate.
Mm-hmm.
So the case data and things like that, and we're connecting up to, is Johns Hopkins data, USA Facts. There's people that were collecting these data, and those change daily, and they actually retroactively get fixed if they're messed up, right? So and some places would dump a whole bunch of data once a week and once every day, right? So there's those data streams, we thought, okay, we have to have those, right? The other big one that was somewhat dynamic was the interventions. So some idea of social distancing. So how much have people changed their behavior? Mm-hmm. So that was at the time, at the beginning, that was the only intervention, right? We all sat in our houses, and that was it, right? And then testing. How rapidly could you roll out testing? And those are the two big dynamic ones that have always been tough to wrangle, and we tried to capture. And then the other ones were, some of the social ones were how mobile your population is. Are they moving together in and out of a city every day, or basically is it a very rural community where people are spread out? And then residential density, which we know that it spread fast, especially at the beginning. And on the dashboard, you can actually go back in time. So you can go back to March if you want and look at the beginning, and you see kind of these, you see New York and San Francisco and Seattle, and these big population centers light up. And at the beginning, that was a really important driver of where this was spreading, was just that population density. And then the other ones were health environmental things. So the demographics of, is your population aged? Are there, we found some things that tracked with race, right? Demographics, I think, affect this. And as we know, those things are also connected to many, many other social determinants, right? And so the CDC has a social vulnerability index, which is a really sophisticated tool that brings a lot of this together. So we borrowed some of that too, and used some of the thinking that they had done to say, here's actually the factors that are driving some of these inequities, and tried to bring that into, because as it turns out, it was important for the pandemic as well. So that whole last set of, you're looking at a picture of it, sort of the purple slices, those pizza or pie slices at the end, all have to do with things that are health and environmental. And most of those are, I call static, in that they don't change daily, but they're sort of demographic shifts that change over years.
I think one of the more interesting aspects of the PVI is the ability to cluster, and I didn't get to try to play around with it, but the idea that you can cluster according to which different counties have this similar shape of the pie. And so can you say more about that, and if you've learned anything from those kinds of clustering capacity?
Yeah, I think that was, you used that for the applications, right?
Yeah. If you want to describe the clustering, I can tag in on how it's been used.
Sure. Yeah. So if and I'm sorry for using my fingers, but imagine 2 pie slices, and radial slices. One has 2 fingers up and one has 5 fingers up. So if this is county A and this is county B, that looks more like my 5-finger one. Clustering is essentially find me everything that looks like my hand, my 5-finger hand, and find me everything that looks like my 2-fingered hand. And that's important because even though they might have similar overall vulnerability, the reasons are different, which is exactly, I think, what you're describing there. Is that clustering is you want to say, why are these counties, why are they in need? What do they have? What's driving their vulnerability? And so that clustering aspect is really just takes a clustering like anyone would do with, choosing which Netflix movie you're going to watch next, or any of these other, applications, but asks it about the PVI profiles for counties. And that's actually one of the first use cases, right?
Yeah, one of the first use cases was working to find peer counties, and working with sort of interdepartmental health and human services task forces in this space. One of the first uses early on was to look at sort of cities that FEMA had really proactively moved to intervene on, places like New Orleans that are vulnerable to disasters in general. And then we're able to sort of evaluate the impact of their intervention in that area compared to sister cities or peer cities based on clustering. So worked with them to cluster based on the data types that don't change, those static measures of vulnerability, to find cities that were, or counties that were similar to Orleans County in those demographics, but had sort of the opposite intervention level. So sort of identifying peer counties with the same vulnerability look and see what was actually the effect of intervention when everything else was as similar as possible. So that was one example use case.
Did you find that it was persuasive to like decision makers in Orleans County to be able to say these interventions are working, or you could do more of X and it's likely to work? I mean, could they hear that?
Absolutely. They heard it for sure. Sort of we're not within the sort of prediction or controlling that kind of thing. But we have other example use cases where people have used it to visualize and communicate. I've worked with a national manufacturing company that has had to make decisions to open up or shut down manufacturing facilities, and they're the same company but have factories in very different parts of the country. So they've used it to try to communicate why they're making different decisions, right? Yes, we know your peers in this other location, in the other factory, are open or closed, but here's sort of why. Here's why these sites are more vulnerable right now than these.
Do you work directly with a user like that? Because I mean, it's a complex system, and learn to read those patterns takes some patience and staying with it. So, do you work directly with a company like that? And how do they find you? How do you find them?
And people have come to the website, and we've seen sort of can track usage all over the place. Certainly the partnering with the CDC, they actually mirror PVI within their COVID tracker was a group that also were able to help think through, and we worked with directly of what some use cases of this would be. We've got some different metrics. One example use case identified for this was for mask distribution. At a time where masks were the key intervention and sort of advocacy there. But also sort of our website has our email addresses and say contact here. So I've met with people at the companies and we've walked through on Zoom or Teams or whatever, but everybody's favorite tool is, and we've walked through it to try to help talk about possibilities.
Does the index now, or does it potentially have pollution as a health stressor in the mix?
It does. There is so right now, and I should say, we recently put up a new model that includes vaccine data, because that's available now in a way that it was not. Well, there was no vaccine, but then the data weren't available until really the beginning of 2021. So there's actually two parallel models right now, but they do both include a part of a slice where air pollution is a contributor to overall, and we know that that's important. I think what's hard about that as pollution in this case being PM 2.5.
Yeah.
In the air, right? How much particulate matter? I think that at a county level, that's a tough one to build a lot of conclusions on, just because the county, they're so huge. The western counties look so different than the eastern counties. But the framework could definitely adapt if we get more resolute data, or if down to the level of if people are wearing personal exposure monitors. There's nothing that says we couldn't incorporate that information and average it out, or if we do it at the census tract level or something lower. Or a city block level, that's certainly possible. But for right now, I think that the only thing I can think of for the PVI that is pollution based, what I think is that air pollution. I think it's the PM 2.5.
So, tomorrow on COVID calls, we're interviewing researchers that are using satellite data to get at neighborhood scale air pollution burdens. And so this question of what kind of how resolved does the data need to be useful? And then one of my co-hosts is someone that actually is an anthropologist that studies community air monitoring. So ground level, those sensors. So we'll come back to that. But one thing I just want to put in the mix is that as someone that studied the environmental justice movement for many years, it's exciting to see the kind of new attention to it that's come in the last year or so, and the incredibly important role NIHS will play in figuring out where that attention should go. But I think a real important cusp in that movement is moving from problem characterization, knowing you've got undisproportionate burden, to saying what do you do? And so the way that this model gives you a spectrum of choices with kind of an assessment of efficacy, in principle, it's the kind of decision tool that you need to move the EJ movement from problem characterization to moving the dial. So it's really exciting to think at the conceptual level about that.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. And I exactly hope that's how this kind of thing is used, because it's connected to a bunch of nerdy statistics and things like that are useful for, you can send a message like, if your community were able to address this thing by this much, you would benefit this much.
Right.
Those are actionable things. We said if only this problem were ameliorated a little bit, here are some benefits, right? And that's, I'm not saying everyone should be prescriptive based on math models, but certainly that helps guide, what you fix, because certainly you're right. You don't want to just say, if we just gave them more money, everything would be fine, because sometimes, but that's not, it's different reasons in different places. And I think that the pandemic is really brought that to light, is how different, where you live through this thing means so much about how you're doing and what your daily life is, in a way that I don't think of America. I don't like thinking of America that way, but it's it's different.
What about, so, I mean, at the beginning, you articulated the importance of selecting data sets that gave you national scope. But you also, there's the problem of like county scale air data doesn't tell you much about disproportionate burden. If there was like fence line data from whatever source, community air monitors or the company, would the index be able to integrate that? And one, just as a data type, and two, even if it wasn't available everywhere, are you able to take advantage of data that is only available in patches?
Yes. So that there are two basic ways to take advantage of, I'm going to call it missing data. So if data aren't available anywhere, you can just do those same modeling anyway and just say that, well, there's missing data and there's more uncertainty. That's one way to do it, which is sort of ignoring it. But the model doesn't break in a sense. But I think the right thing to do with that would be more of a targeted approach, where you're actually building a model for a region, right? So if you thought that if you had that fence line or local level data for a particular region, you might as well just, in a sense, mouse scroll in on an area and say, let's build a model for this area. And you can always zoom back out and say, how does this compare to if you want to aggregate it back to the county. But that's really what we're working on right now is the concept is there and the model is there, but now we're actually working on the software tools to be able to say, county is fine, but Los Angeles County deserves to be zoomed in on. And what if we zoomed way in on Los Angeles County and broke it up into neighborhoods, and then maybe zoomed back to a state level, and that sort of in and out interactive. So the framework can handle it. It's about making the software that can do it.
Yeah, let me go down that line a little bit further. And I may lose battery here, so I apologize if I fade out. But given that one of the things that we know is that there's a strong correlation between like voting patterns and vaccination patterns, are there data sets like that you've thought about incorporating or not, or data that you would like to kind of at least play around with to see what you might get?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to suggest that we both answer this separately, and I'm going to answer it from, if as not a federal employee, if I were just writing a blog, really strong mathematical predictor of, especially right now, vaccination rates and infection rates, on the opposite end, is unfortunately very political. And so if you were to look at the nationwide PVI map and look at where all the hot spots are right now, they basically migrated to certain regions of the country that vote in a similar way. And if you zoom back to the beginning of the pandemic, that wasn't true, right? So I think the key thing is including vaccinations in there. You really see this pattern start to come out, and it's difficult to ignore that pattern. We have not included that in the PVI model so as to keep it things that are that one can objectively measure data-wise, not based on a poll. And then you might have a different.
I did. Also, when you're talking about sort of advocating and finding use cases, not that all the data that's in here is functional, but there's strong epidemiology sort of to what goes in those models. And when you think about what are useful predictors and what are your useful ways to communicate and sort of empower decision makers, than putting things based on sort of the epidemiological drivers underneath is.
Well, and particularly in a context where there's so much contestation about what's good science, if a science contribution, and it's an interesting dilemma for social scientists because a lot of our data is considered political from the get-go, which can justify just excluding it. But on the other hand, strategic communications, you have to acknowledge that it is considered political.
Mhm.
And so in trying to develop more integrated data approaches that would include political cultural analysis, for example,
Mhm.
it's like there's a bundle of things to kind of attend to.
Yeah, our hope is that, so all the data are public, all the hard work of scraping the data and putting it together, that was one of the things from the beginning we put out and continue to put out. And I think that's why, again, partnering with NIH over it means that there's a stable place where the data live. People can go there. It's not subject to manipulate. Like, there's no company trying to make money off it, or maybe it is just the data are what they are, right? Our hope is that if somebody has an interesting hypothesis to something that might be coming out of those data, that they can use these data to test that hypothesis, whether it be a very political hot button thing or something obvious that we're all missing. I'm hoping that the data get used in some way.
Something this reminds me of is the toxic release inventory when it was set up back in the 90s, is that, it's a messy data set because it's corporate provided, but because it's corporate provided, they can't contest what it says. And so the way that an imperfect data set can still be, it's been politically powerful to have the TRI. I mean, just watching environmental perception over the years. And so, having a strategic sensibility about how to both get usable data, but also data that has credibility in different kind of spheres, I think is interestingly part of the science, not aside from the science. And the other thing that I'm listening as a teacher of, I think one of the things that the system does is points to the need for data advocacy, not just environmental policy advocacy or health policy, but data advocacy. And in this work, have either of you seen or come to understand missing data that you would really get behind, saying like, look, we've got to collect this so that we can better characterize these vulnerabilities?
So there's data that's being collected on, all aspects of that. And so it's a separate issue of saying we wish it was easy to grab for us is different than saying it isn't being sort of looked at there. But we haven't yet found any sort of positivity rate kind of information at the county level, right? Of sort of, we can get information on testing, but it is not readily publicly available that we have found yet of what those positivity rates are. And that becomes important, especially for things like predictive modeling and understanding sort of sampling bias.
What does that say about the positivity rates that you see in the Johns Hopkins data? Is that, I don't know where that comes from, but it's data that's not useful or not reliable for your modeling, or?
Well, I would say that there are there's a lot of footnotes on that calculation that they do. And so I think it's very reliable in the sense that they're being very consistent with how they calculate it, and that for a given county that has those data, they've been really careful to do that very well. And I think that if you were to look at the country as a whole, your confidence in a positivity rate would differ across the country. And I think that's a challenge presenting those data.
But it's also a really important lesson of your vulnerability index of the need for data documentation to make any data usable. And so could a researcher go into your model and create a kind of restricted space where they could put in some data that might be controversial to include, or that they don't have full reliability in, but are interested in, where they can see its outcomes without kind of public visibility and really an experimental approach to the model itself?
Yes. Yes, they can do that with, they can certainly take the data, and if they're, if they're a code nerd, they can take the data and enjoy the playground of whatever methods they like to use. if they particularly want to use the visualization style that we have here, the PVI dashboard is a self-encapsulated entity. So you can manipulate the data in it, but you can't add your own data to the dashboard. There's a standalone version of that's called Talks by GIS. That there's a web app for that where you can go and bring in any data you want at any scale. So it can be really anywhere. Again, county level, census state, census tract level. Like, so that would be the playground for that right now. What we're currently working on is the software sort of toolkit that somebody who, if you're an ArcGIS user, you can plug this in and create your own stuff. And if you are just sort of a consumer or viewer of these kind of maps, you could bring your data in that way too. So we're trying to fill in that gap. So right now there's an imperfect, like an alpha version of the, you can do your own analysis through this sort of framework, but hope to get that out as soon as we can.
Do you imagine that as generating, some of the mapping tools like the EPA CMAC and things? I mean, it's generated like a ton of scientific work over the years. Is that one of the promises of this, that it will be the scaffolding for more finely focused studies by researchers all over?
I think the integration piece, it has a lot to offer for that. For the data integration across scales. It's the math is simple in that it's not asking for a big giant Bayesian backwards calculation that takes a time. It's not that. The prediction piece, that's super hard. that's actually that's a giant. Allison can tell you about the machine there because I don't understand it, but that's a really hard one. But the actual, just the simplest framework to draw the diagrams is straightforward. And I think the good part about that is that if you add in new data and your picture changes, it's obvious to you that it changed. And I'm hoping that convinces people to say, oh, this would be a good framework for asking the kinds of questions that you're proposing there. And I think if we get the software right, and again, anyone can have it then, and they can, do more creative applications. Somebody sent me something the other day where someone had used it to visualize baseball scores, baseball player performance. Yeah, they're picking the best baseball players. It's a really cool application. I'd never think of that in a million years. So yeah, I'm hoping that the creativity of the world is always greater than, any particular team. Yeah.
It is. I mean, the data work that has been done kind of in unlikely places over the years is really impressive to watch, and to build infrastructure that lays ground for that, I think, is so important. Allison, can you just tell us more about the predictive challenge and technically what that entails, and who knows how to do it, and how it gets reviewed and credentialed and that whole mess?
So the prediction work is the modeling itself is done by a brilliant Bayesian statistician in my branch at NIHS, Dr. Matt Wheeler, that really was able to set up it is definitely an extreme machine learning kind of predictor tool, but something that takes sort of the scale of data that we have and can fit within sort of a two-stage nested model where you're first predicting cases and then predicting deaths from cases. And sort of there's a unique structure and limitation to this data as sort of missing data was filling in, as sort of the overall rate of transmissible cases has changed. It's become, that data has been very sparse at different times in the pandemic in different places, and dealing with that complexity has been an interesting challenge. So the Bayesian, so the predictions on the web tool are off of a Bayesian machine learner that is geared for prediction and not interpretation, right? We've done some modeling where the pi visualizes the data, The team members that David's mentioned earlier have worked on sort of the epidemiological modeling of trying to understand which data types should be in there and seem to have strong associations. And then the predictions of sort of new cases and deaths at a local level are done within an extreme machine learning framework.
So tell us how you're using prediction and interpretation differently, or they clearly mean different things to you. And then also what you mean by extreme machine learning.
Yeah. That is an abuse of jargon, right? So here when I'm saying prediction, I'm saying we on the dashboard include predictions out into the future of sort of the midterm. What are you expecting in terms of number of cases and number of deaths? And sort of the machine learning model uses sort of high dimensional data to try to make those predictions out in the future. I'm saying I'm abusing jargon to say it's an extreme machine learner, but machine learning means lots of things to lots of people, and I'm not going to be able to discuss all of that, but I was being flippant in my head of there's some methods that work to be white box tools, things like decision trees that try to both do prediction, but also reveal a little bit under the hood, where there are other suites of machine learners that I'm saying are extreme, I guess, only because they're black box models. Right, these are algorithms tuned for prediction, and it's not necessarily something you can sort of pull out. You don't get nice regression coefficients that give you the effect size, right? It's able to model nonlinear and very complex structures with sort of parameter optimization to do prediction, knowing that it's not necessarily a white box model that'll help.
How, to what extent do you need to understand the biology in order to do the computation well?
For the prediction?
Yeah, especially at that stage. But I mean, it's been a long running question in bioinformatics. I know it's like you're at it. And especially, thinking about educating a new generation that somehow is working at these cross points. Who's at the table when you're actually extreming the model in that way and kind of making sure things are kind of on point?
Yeah, so we definitely have tried to follow sort of general best practices of, thinking through in collaborative groups. Here is an analysis plan, here is a model and how we're setting it up. That I've had the sort of whiteboard discussions that haven't been on an actual whiteboard, but by Zoom, right? Where we've got multiple people that are experts in forecasting and modeling and statistics and biostatistics, and have sort of debated advantages and disadvantages to different modeling tools within that context, to play around with sort of variable selection or sort of different approaches that just allow for sort of correction of these multiple risk factors within there, and to have sort of peer-reviewed discussions of what modeling options there are, and then sort of internally and externally peer-reviewed discussions of the outcomes there. So it's collaborative. And then we also make sure in these complex models that sort of the code has been re-implemented and checked as well. So sort of have a team of people that not only implement it once, but sort of confirm and make sure there's rigor and software.
Yeah, for this particular problem, the sort of there's a sniff test that you can kind of do on a prediction result where at a certain point in time, if you just let the machine learning go, it'll say things like all of New York City is gone, or Phoenix, Arizona has more deaths than they have, and so there's like those obvious things to catch. I think actually sort of looking for those to pop up helps you decide whether your assumptions and things are reasonable in your bounds, and that's been, besides the discussions and the panel part of it, you can kind of be tamping down those kind of problems as they pop up, because again, in a daily model, that is every day we're looking at this and being like, wait a minute, something's off, or a county doesn't deliver their data
Right.
as we expected, and so kind of smooth it over time. And the dynamic part is probably the hardest part of the most technically challenging part of this, I think.
Yeah. The discussion during the pandemic about whether conventional peer review is kind of too slow to keep up with the pandemic and the science has been especially interesting from a history of science perspective, because on one hand it is new, but the way that new forms of peer review and cross-checking have had to be invented, as like this standard journal review may not be enough to do the cross-checking that you're talking about here. And so how do you invent the forms of oversight that you need, although it's supposed to be external? So this story of like how you built robustness, like what we would call a social infrastructure, like whose eyes do you put on it when, and how do you credential it, partly by inventing that social infrastructure to go around the kind of bench infrastructure. We don't have a lot more time, so I want to turn quickly to the curricular development that you're supporting at NIHS as a window into what you've learned from this about the kind of data, well, let's say integrated data education that we need to support going forward in order to have the research capacity that kind of you're building for us. But tell us a little about just why you did the curriculum element. I know it's part of NIH's mission, but why this? And also just the bigger picture, like you want to be knocking on our doors at the university saying, y'all need to do X.
Yeah, so definitely the motivation for the curriculum, right? If this is part of our effort to educate some people at all levels. So the curriculum was targeted towards high school students and sort of vetted with Wake County public schools here and some school teachers. I think the pandemic has highlighted even more than in normal times the need for fluency in sort of trying to understand data. Certainly this was relevant immediately, right? Talking about COVID has been scientific talks that need no introduction for the first time ever, right? We know where we're all sitting in this. So an important, timely topic in a time that we're trying to communicate science around it as well. And sort of this is an example of data and data science that is sort of out there, reproducible, and at some level, hopefully easy to understand some of the main interpretations. Right? The math itself is actually not all that high level. You don't need calculus to calculate this, so it's an approachable metric and summary, and sort of walking through with students how do you merge big data? How can you think about sort of rolling things up and doing it in a way that matters.
Yeah, no, I love the curriculum, the assignments a lot. It's something that we can close with is in trying to like when I teach environmental health governance courses, I have students learn to find and use things like EPA's EJ data, that kind of thing. And it's surprising how much of the data isn't very stable. Like the Government Accounting Office will produce this beautiful report about Superfund sites and flooding, and the next time I go to teach, the map doesn't work anymore. And tell us a little bit about if and how and why housing your system at NIHS might give it a little more durability, where it not only can be used by scientists, but integrated into educational programs in a sustained way.
I mean, like I said, some of the Institute's mission, where I sit in DIR, is, like I said, innovative research that extramural people need to go get funding to sort of, get the infrastructure right. Something gets started as sort of a pilot or preliminary data. Not that it's not vetted, right? Sort of you normally have to build resources to support that kind of effort long term with unsteady funding, which, or being a within sort of NIH is a unique opportunity to sort of proactively plan what you'll need to be stable, and let sort of science and the mission drive that. It's just a different model of sort of resourcing research that has advantages and disadvantages, but some real key advantages. That's going to be.
It's actually an important element to teach in teaching the model, because the question of like, what does it take to get the science done? That's what we need all of our students to understand, even if they're not going to become scientists themselves. So that's an interesting part of the story. I think Mike is out. We need to close, but do either of you have any further comments that you want to make about your vision for the model, or what you hope people understand about the effort?
I wanted to say thank you for doing programs like this, because I think that part of that outreach and education piece is that everyone's going to understand this in a different way, and not just the data, but not just the, with this particular tool, some people are drawn to the visualization because they're colorful and they kind of pop out, and some people say, oh, I get that right away. Like my 8-year-old son, when he was 7, was explaining to me the model like very cogently, and other people glom onto a totally different piece of it, the data-ness, right? And so I feel like, especially COVID is really useful because we're all living it and experiencing it in a way that is different than other things that you have to be that you know about. And I think that if you hear about it, if you talk about it, if you look at it, if you see the data, whatever your route in, I think actually helps with that level of understanding in a different way than we're used to for any other scientific problem I can think of.
That's a great articulation, because it does suggest why you need diversity at the table, disciplinary diversity, generational diversity, because in a research resource like that, it doesn't just say one thing. It says a lot of different things pointing in a lot of different directions.
I think the generational one is probably something that you also see with your students, is that every year the students bring more and more sophistication to what I had as they come in, and there are many aspects of diversity that one needs, I think, to get a handle on a problem like this.
Yeah. Allison, do you have anything to close with?
No, I'll leave it there. I thought he put that first.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and Mike and I will want to follow up with many questions, but thank you first for your work in your ongoing work and your work on the index, and for talking with us. It's really, we've appreciated it a lot, and you've got fans out there, so please keep at it.
We really appreciate the opportunity. This
thanks
is great
so much.
fun.